Oh, hey there. If there is one thing you should know about me, it's that I love me some Castlevania. And while I'd consider myself a pretty die-hard fan of the series, when I was younger, I wasn't into it quite as much as I am now. Sure, I started off with the first 3 games on the NES, and I loved them enough to name my pet hermit crabs after the characters. It was the early 90s, and hermit crabs were like, the pet. But I didn't end up continuing with the series for quite a long time. I'd always see ads for Super Castlevania 4, but in the Super Nintendo era, I was heavily invested in the Mega Man X series, and as a kid, you can't just go out and buy whatever game you want. Fast forward a bit, and I'd hear about a game from a friend of mine called Castlevania Symphony of the Night. All I knew about it was that you played as Dracula's son. I'd go over to his house and watch him play, and eventually, after some convincing, he let me borrow the game. It was at that moment that I was re-hooked back into the series after a long hiatus. When the topic of Castlevania comes up, it goes without question that people will often attribute it to this game. There are those who claim that Symphony of the Night is the best Castlevania game, and one of the best video games of all time. There are also quite a few fans of the DS trilogy, as the Nintendo DS was insanely popular in its heyday. It also helped that the DS games looked the most like Symphony of the Night, visually speaking. But before that trilogy of games, there was another. A trilogy of varying quality. You could call the Gameboy Advance trilogy a mixed bag. Aria of Sorrow is considered to be Symphony of the Night levels of quality, breathing fresh new life into the series, getting its own sequel, and even inspiring the playstyle of other games such as Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Harmony of Dissonance is often known for trying to be as Symphony of the Night as possible, with the main character barring a striking resemblance to Alucard, having 2 castles to explore. Oh, but did I forget to mention the absolutely awful music quality? Yeah, that. Lastly, but also ironically the first in the trilogy, is the game that is often overlooked and overshadowed. That's right, this is just another video about Castlevania Circle of the Moon. First unveiled in September at the Tokyo Game Show in 2000 was the next Castlevania game after Symphony of the Night. Not including that one. Or that one. Or that one. Okay, it's the next in the Igavania style of Castlevania games. And yes, believe it or not, Castlevania Legends on the Game Boy came out after Castlevania Symphony of the Night on the PlayStation. There is sadly very little information regarding this build of the game, aside from a single write-up that is on GameSpot. At the time, it was stated that there would be 2 playable characters, Nathan Graves and Hugh Baldwin, but to my knowledge, no video or screenshots exist of Hugh's gameplay. From the sounds of things, the control scheme of this prototype version of the game was also quite a bit different. Taken directly from the article, they say, if you tap jump and then hold the R button, Nathan or Hugh will cling to the walls. You may then change the direction and jump again. This sounds like an alternate version of how the kick boots eventually ended up working in the final game, whereas now you just jump against a wall and immediately jump off of it. No longer is there the whole Mega Man X style of clinging to the wall, which I think would have been pretty cool, but at the same time probably would have broken the game a little bit. If you press the R button quickly, Nathan or Hugh will perform a super jump. This one does remain in the game, but no longer are you pressing R twice, you can just hold up and then press R, which I think is a lot easier. If you double tap the D-pad, Hugh or Nathan will go sprinting forward. If you press jump while running, they will perform a slide maneuver. And this is probably one of the better changes, because as it's described, that means you couldn't jump while running, which would completely defeat the purpose of the dash boots, because the moment you get them, you need to jump across a large gap to continue on with the rest of the game. But as it stands, it sounds like you would just slide and then fall. So obviously this was definitely a change for the better. So with that in mind, news of Circle of the Moon pretty much dwindled until 6 months later when it was released in Japan in March, and then another 3 months later when it was released in the US in June. Now something to keep in mind is that Circle of the Moon was not produced by Koji Igarashi, even though it has all the makings of an Igavania game. In fact, it wasn't even developed by the main Konami team, but instead the Konami Computer Entertainment Kobe, or KCEK, a subsidiary of the main Konami branch. Its producers were Shigeharu Umezaki and Etsunobu Ibaisu. Basically, this was the same team who worked on the Nintendo 64 Castlevania games. I know, I promise you, it's not going to be as bad as those, just stick with me. But before that, they had a pretty rich history working with 2D games on the NES and SNES, including games such as Goemon and the Contra series. Castlevania was actually a launch title for the Game Boy Advance, so it had a lot riding on its shoulders, and luckily, it was mostly met with praise. The criticisms it did receive were typically due to the incredibly dark color palette of the game, making it harder to see on the Game Boy Advance, which at launch did not have a backlight, combined with what people thought were some stiff controls and a few choppy animations. But who cares about any of that? Because I'm here to tell you about my opinion on it. When you first boot up the game, you're immediately greeted with a familiar audio track. The title screen and file select just straight up uses Rondo of Blood's Requiem theme from the title screen, which is a pretty cool callback right away. Granted, up until the point of writing this script, I apparently was under the Mandela effect, because I always thought that the song that played in Circle of the Moon was from the file select screen of Symphony of the Night. Little did I know that that song is called Prayer and is actually an entirely different song. So, the more you know, I guess. Regardless, I thought it was pretty cool to hear the singing coming out of my Game Boy Advance. Starting a new file, we get a quick prologue story giving us the date, 1830, and the setting being an old Austrian castle. Yep, this game actually does not take place at the titular Castlevania, but instead, just some random castle that is in every way basically identical to Castlevania. Also wait, 1830? How did people dress in 1830? Huh. Alright, checks out. You take the role of Nathan Graves, student of Morris Baldwin and rival to his son, Hugh Baldwin, who in fact would be the grandfather of Alec. Hi, it's me from the future, and I'm editing. I also regret ever making that joke, so I'm gonna go ahead and delete it now. Alright, thanks for watching, and back to the video. They get word of Dracula's resurrection through 1830's Twitter, and rush off to stop it, only to find that they were too late, and Carmela was able to revive the Dark Lord. While he isn't quite at full power, he is able to quickly dispose of the young hunters and kidnap, manap, Morris Baldwin, who he plans to use as a sacrifice to regain his full power. Hugh, jealous that Nathan was chosen to inherit the Hunter Whip over him, runs off to save his dad, saying that Nathan is not needed and thus fulfilling his role as a smarmy rival of this game. And I mean, he's got a point, because I don't know how Nathan was chosen over Hugh when Nathan can't even run until you find some old boots in the catacombs. But I digress. This is where our adventure begins, the catacombs. We're 1 minute into the game, and it's already changed up the formula of the starting location. I love this. Castlevania games have always been known for having your adventure start at the entrance of Castlevania, and from here, you work your way up, eventually to the top to confront Dracula. Not Circle of the Moon. You start in the deepest, darkest part, and you're supposed to work your way around to the middle of the castle where the ceremonial room is to confront Dracula. It's a small change, but it's one that I personally think is awesome. In this beginning area, they really set the mood by having us listen to a new mix of Nightmare from Castlevania 3. You know, the song that plays in the deep underground area where you find Alucard? Yeah, it's a nice touch, but as soon as we enter the catacombs proper, we're immediately blessed with what might be one of the best Castlevania songs of all time, Await. Can you believe that this song was never used in another Castlevania game ever again? It wasn't until Super Smash Bros. Ultimate that we finally received a new and updated version of this song. And let me be the first to tell you that it's f***ing awesome. Since I'm on the topic of music, let me just get this out of the way right now. Circle of the Moon has one of the strongest Castlevania soundtracks of all time. I would even go as far as to say it probably has the best soundtrack of the 3 Game Boy Advance Castlevania games. It's the perfect blend of fresh, unique tracks and remixes of old favorites from like Castlevania 1, 3, and Bloodlines. And I know that Castlevania games are known for often remixing older tracks from previous games, but I'm just saying that this game probably does it the best, at least on the GBA. The music fits every setting perfectly, and is such an important driving force for moving on. While I would listen to Aquarius, it'd get me pumped and I'd want to fight through everything in my path. Meanwhile, the sinking old city was perfect for those magical outdoors sections, lit up with a giant moon in the background. Entering the sewers and hearing the return of Nightmare, it'd creep me out and make me want to rush through this area as fast as possible. I can't say it enough, I absolutely love the soundtrack here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is akin to an Igavania game, and that still holds true, even though Koji Igarashi himself did not work on it and has even openly criticized several aspects of the game, such as some of the animations, the color, and the DSS system. The latter of which he actually agreed is a good system, but he doesn't think it fits the Castlevania lore. Quick sidebar, I appreciate everything that Iga has done for the Castlevania series, but I do know that people like to point to his criticisms of Circle of the Moon as a gateway into saying that this game is bad. But let's keep in mind that one of the driving forces behind Iga working on Symphony of the Night was his utter hatred of bottomless pits. He praises Rondo of Blood purely for the fact that it doesn't have that many bottomless pits in it. Essentially, it sounds like he might not be the best at traditional platformers, so when he criticizes the controls of Circle of the Moon, I'm just saying, maybe take it with a grain of salt. Anyway, gameplay-wise, I always considered this game to be a good balance between the Igavania style, or Metroidvania for those who prefer that term, and the classic style. While I did really enjoy Symphony of the Night, whips are just cooler than swords, so returning to a main character with a whip is just fun. As stated before, you take the role of Nathan Graves. His weapon is the Hunter's Whip, but also has access to typical Castlevania sub-weapons, such as knives, holy water, cross boomerangs, and the stopwatch. These all of course use hearts as energy as well. Alongside this, Nathan can also equip armor and accessories to boost or adjust his stats. Oh yeah, stats are a thing too. Enemies not only drop equipment, but experience points, which are used to level up Nathan, further powering him up. As you explore, you'll find abilities or items which act as keys to opening up other previously discovered parts of the castle akin to a Zelda game, which makes sense because while the term Metroidvania is thrown around, Iga himself has gone on record saying that his design philosophy was akin to that of the Zelda series. Throughout the castle, you'll find magical items, giving Nathan access to a double jump, wall jump, the power to smash or push blocks, and eventually getting access to the super jump, seen throughout the series. Lastly, and probably most importantly, is the DSS mechanic this game uses. DSS standing for Dual Setup System. This is a unique power system of this game, allowing the player to change all sorts of attributes about Nathan, be it his stats or the element of his whip, giving him the ability to shoot projectiles, perform special attacks, change his whip into a different weapon entirely, summon large creatures to do full screen damage, even giving him the ability to transform into a glass cannon skeleton. There are 20 cards in total, 10 action cards and 10 attribute cards. You can do one combination at a time, combining any one action card and one attribute card. The effects vary on which combination you select. When the game starts, you won't have any cards, but as you progress, you'll find them dropped from various enemies. Once you find a card, you have it forever and can use it as many times as you want, as long as you have the magic to do so. I always thought that this system was really neat, especially for first-time players, because discovering all the new combinations is just a lot of fun. Even if you go back and play this game years later, you've probably forgotten most of the combinations, so you get to relive that all over again. Obviously you'll find combinations that are better than others, but the real fun is in the experimentation. Circle of the Moon follows a lot of the same design as its predecessor, Symphony of the Night. And this may sound blasphemous to die-hard Symphony fans, but I'd say it might do it a bit better. When I first played Symphony of the Night all those years ago, I got lost countless times. It took me forever to find the Colosseum, due in part to the fact that one of the exits to the clock room opens on a timer. Meaning if you're casually exploring and you don't spend enough time sitting in this one room waiting on an invisible timer, you might never see the statue move. I don't remember how I progressed, but I do remember reaching it, finding the form of mist, only to be stuck on what to do yet again. Because if you were unlucky enough to not find a very specific room all the way in the back of the long library, you would never find the form of bat, which is also essential for progression. Don't even get me started on the gold and silver ring. What I'm getting at is, while I can breeze through Symphony of the Night now, for first-time players, it can definitely be a bit of a hassle. Circle of the Moon, though, is streamlined a lot more, but it's not perfect. For instance, after defeating Adramelech, you step on a switch that destroys a large statue. It's not exactly intuitive that this destroys all of the other statues located in the castle, giving you access to new areas. And unless you specifically remember seeing one of these statues elsewhere, then you're going to be forced to just idly explore until you find one. But ultimately, I think that a new player to Circle of the Moon would have an easier time with progression than a new player to Symphony of the Night. As I mentioned before, your goal isn't to reach the throne room of the castle as per usual, it's instead to reach the ceremonial chamber. Your journey will certainly take you through familiar Castlevania-inspired areas though. The castle entrance is still there, it's just a little off the beaten path. The machine tower is essentially the clock tower of the previous games, and even the throne room makes an appearance. Most areas conclude in a boss fight, and this is definitely where Circle of the Moon steps up the difficulty. While the normal run-of-the-mill enemies aren't all that challenging, the bosses are a real threat, especially if you go in underleveled or don't have a proper grasp of the DSS system yet. Adramelech, the twin dragon zombies, and of course, the final form of Dracula all come to mind as incredibly challenging bosses for your first run through of the game. Since I brought it up though, I might as well go ahead and go on record saying that the final form of Dracula is my favorite Dracula boss fight in the entire series. I've never really had any issues with the final boss of any Castlevania game, but when it came to Circle of the Moon, I absolutely got stomped on my first attempts. It was the first time I was forced to leave, go do something else, which for me was tackling the hidden Coliseum to get the best armor in the game, and coming back at a higher level. But I absolutely love the difficulty here, and I feel that this is how Dracula should be. After defeating his first form, you step into a portal, taking you to some sort of ethereal realm, where Dracula and his new gigantic form await. Not only do I think this form is one of the best looking final forms of Dracula, but the music that plays here really drives home the feeling that this fight is trying to portray. It's hard, but not hopeless. His attacks can be learned, but if you're not careful and slip up, especially when he does this, you're probably going to die. It's just a really fun fight. Now critics, Igarashi included, have often said that the game is entirely too dark and therefore hard to play. But I would like to say that that's not exactly the fault of the game, but the hardware that it was on. The original Game Boy Advance had no backlight, so unless you had one of these, or played on a very brightly lit area, it was definitely a bit of a challenge to see. But with the Game Boy Advance SP, or even playing this on a Nintendo DS, this is no longer an issue. In fact, I'd say one of the best ways to play this game is on the Wii U, because not only is the tablet screen backlit, but you can throw it up on your TV, completely obliterating the brightness issue. So while I'll acknowledge that the game is dark, I don't necessarily think that's a detriment nowadays when there's so many ways to play it with a bright screen. For being a launch title on the GBA, I think the sprite work is pretty great. And while it wasn't quite able to replicate the exact level of detail enemies had in Symphony of the Night, what they did give us was enjoyable to look at. The bosses especially are very detailed, and probably some of the most unique designs in the series. While Circle of the Moon is often overshadowed by the games that came after it, it definitely paved the way for games going forward, and even streamlined a lot of elements. I know that Igarashi has been vocal about his feelings towards Circle of the Moon, even going as far as to remove it from the main Castlevania canon, but I would also be willing to bet that he was probably inspired by this game too, and a lot of the ideas that it brought to the table. The friendly rival that eventually becomes a boss started showing up quite frequently after Circle of the Moon, for instance. The team that made this had their work cut out for them, as they not only had to live up to the hype that was Symphony of the Night, but they also had to make a game that captured the feel of an Igavania without having the assistance of the man himself, while also building and designing a game for a brand new hardware that they had zero experience with. Sure, there were certainly improvements that could have been made, such as the fact there's no shop in the game, so if you want to stock up on healing items, you have to do a quick grind to get them, but most of those issues were addressed in future games, and I think that's what's important. They even went out of their way to put in additional modes of play after you beat the game, accessed by inputting a special word as your name when making a new file. Naming it Fireball gives you access to Magician mode, which adjusts your stats and starts you off with all the DSS cards in the game. There's a Thief mode giving you an insanely high luck stat so you can hopefully get OP items early, a Shooter mode that adds a new sub-weapon, gives Nathan a ton of hearts and even reduces the amount of hearts needed to use sub-weapons, and of course Fighter mode, which prevents the use of spells, but gives Nathan a huge boost in strength and defense. So if you're a fan of replayability in games, Circle of the Moon certainly has it in spades. I've been thinking about this game a lot lately, and I wanted to give it the coverage that I thought it deserved, because I truly do feel that Circle of the Moon is one of the most overlooked Castlevania games in the franchise. I do think that if you're a fan of the series, or just Metroidvania style games in general, you should definitely pick it up. Like I said before, it's on the Wii U eShop as of recording this video, but that is coming to a close in 2022. So if you are interested in the game, then your best bet is to just get it now as opposed to waiting until later. Anyway, my name is AJ, and this was just another video about Castlevania Circle of the Moon. Whew. I guess it is that bad.